Good afternoon. My name is Vasilios Marinis, and I'm Associate Professor of Christian Art and Architecture here at Yale. Professor Norbert Rob Nelson will not be joining us today. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this penultimate lecture in our series, and I'm also delighted to introduce our speaker and respondent. Our speaker today, Panayotis Sergapitos, is the Gutenberg Distinguished Research Fellow in Byzantine Studies at the University of Mainz and Emeritus Professor of Byzantine Literature at the University of Cyprus. He studied Byzantine history and literature, history of Byzantine art and musicology at the University of Munich, and classics and Byzantine literature at Harvard University, from where he received his PhD in 1990. He has published numerous books, including Narrative Structure in the Byzantine Vernacular Romances, The Study of Medieval Greek Romance, Theodoros Metochitis on Greek Philosophy and Ancient History, and most recently, in 2021, an English translation of the 13th century verse romance Livistros and Rhodamni. His edited volume on medieval narratives between history and fiction from the center to the periphery of Europe 1100 to 1400, co-edited with Lars Mortensen, has become a classic in the field. Professor Agapitos is a polymath with many fruitful enthusiasms. Some 90 articles in international journals and collective volumes cover subjects as varied as the critical edition of Byzantine texts and the theory of editorial method, the history of manuscripts and education in Byzantium, the literary interpretation of Byzantine texts, Byzantine rhetoric and poetics, issues of methodology in the application of literary theory to medieval texts, the representation and literary function of death in Byzantine literature, as well as the image of Byzantium in modern Greek literature. Over the past years, he has been working on a new history of Byzantine literature, a project for which he has already published a series of articles. Parallel to his scholarly activities, he is a writer of historical crime fiction. In 2003, he published his Byzantine mystery novel, The Ebonite Lute, set in 9th century Caesarea of Cappadocia. It was followed by The Copper Eye and The Enamel Medusa. All three novels have been translated into Czech and some into Italian and French, and they're absolutely wonderful. I've read all three of them, and I highly recommend them. Our respondent today, Ammanuel Bourbouhakis, is Associate Professor of Classics at Princeton University. A native of the Caribbean and Greece, he received his PhD from Harvard in 2007. He has held prestigious fellowships at the Freie Universität Berlin and at the University of Freiburg. His research interests include textual criticism and Greek paleography, rhetoric, historiography, medieval criticism and aesthetics, letter writing, and the reception and transmission of classical texts in the Middle Ages. His book on the epitaphos for Manuel I Komnenos by Evstathios of Thessaloniki, published in 2017, is a work of profound erudition and unparalleled eloquence. And I'm particularly delighted today to welcome virtually to Yale not only two distinguished scholars, but also friends. I now invite Professor Agapitos to begin his lecture.
Thank you very much, Vasily, for your kind words and for the invitation. I would like to now share my screen in order for you to get the PowerPoint. Okay, is it visible? Yes, I suppose so.
Yes.
So I just want to say before I start that part of this research goes back a few years, and my colleague from the University of Cyprus, Maria Parani, Associate Professor of Byzantine Art, she helped me a lot with finding photographs and talking with me about a number of art historical matters. So I always would like to thank her for the work that she put into this somewhat peculiar project. So, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. In the opening sentences of the Gospel according to John, the fathers of the church discerned an interrelation of word and vision, connected, moreover, to the archetypal creative act, namely God's creation of the world. Byzantine artists represented this interrelation by depicting Christ holding a book. In this mosaic from the 11th century church of St. Luke's Panayotis in central Greece, placed above the entrance to the main building, the naos, the open book displays the following words of Christ. I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. Also from the John Gospel. For those passing underneath the mosaic, the composition signaled the passage from uncomprehending darkness to the light of life. The book, as a represented object, pointed at by the Savior himself, becomes the carrier of multiple layers of textual and visual significations. In a late 10th century manuscript, the beginning of the John Gospel consciously displays the coexistence of these layers. On the left-hand page, the evangelist, looking towards heaven, accepts the divine teaching of God, represented by the blessing hand extended from a cloud and the actual words descending onto the head of John, while at the same time, he dictates the text to his disciple by moving his own hand in a reflection of God's gesture. On the right-hand page, the gospel text begins under an ornamental band. In its center, the open book, a reflection of the open book held by Christ, bears the title of the gospel. In this way, the creative act of God and the creative act of the evangelist are visually internalized on the page, while simultaneously they are orally displayed through the public reading from the book. It is in this interrelation of word and image that I wish to examine in my talk today by exploring the aesthetics of what I have termed layering in Byzantine art and literature. For this purpose, I shall use two pairs of oppositional yet complementary concepts of Hellenistic rhetoric, which the Byzantines enriched by infusing them with Neoplatonic philosophy and Christian theology. These concepts are, on the one hand, hate, ipsos, and depth, vathos, and on the other, transparency, enargia, and obscurity, asaphia. These interrelated concepts allow the writers and painters to create in their works a simultaneous sense of self-absorption and self-representation. For example, in a luxurious 12th century manuscript containing the liturgical homilies of Gregory of Nazareth, the illuminator has placed at the beginning a portrait of the author. The author is framed by a layered building. The viewers can see its exterior, the upper level, that is, of the domes and the red walls. Its interior, the middle layers of luxurious marble revetments on the inner walls, and its surrounding space, the lower layers of a garden with trees and fountains. Gregory, pensive while writing, sits within another colonnade-like frame. The whole framing construction externalizes in a most intense visual manner the internalized figure of the self-absorbed author. This complex image functions as an authorizing prologue to the homilies, since Christ, in the upper right corner of the inner frame, dictates to Gregory the divinely inspired words of the text. The brightly colored miniature emanates a simultaneous sense of transparency. Every single constituent part is most clearly depicted, and obscurity. Any attempt at a logical reconstruction of the building must fail. In a similar manner, an author will frame himself in a layered prologue to a work of his, creating this very sense of absorption and representation. For example, Constantine Manassis in the 12th century prefaces a description of a pavement mosaic at the imperial palace by beginning with a seemingly unconnected essay-like excursus on the importance of the visual arts in Hellenistic antiquity. The preface then ends thus: all of these things are written in the books of the ancients and are quoted in historical narratives. But I have seen myself the work of a painter. My eyes were charmed by the spectacle, and I truly admired the craftsmanship of this person. I thought, therefore, that only an enemy of beauty would cover with silence such an artistic work and would go no further than admiring this wondrous creation. Now then, I shall grant speech to this work, and I shall present it as far as possible to the gaze of those who have not seen it. The essay-like opening consists of quotations from Hellenistic texts on art, while Manassis points himself to this collage of intertextual images by referring to the books of the ancients. The spectacle of an object, the mosaic, and the admiration for the craft of its creator, the painter, become the mental matrix for the creation of a new object, the text, and the display of another creator's art, the writer. Manassis has built an authorial frame that consists of various layers accentuating his own textual dominance. In these two contemporary visual and textual constructions of an authorial prologue, the body of the author and the body of his book play a crucial part. For while the author's active body is represented through a textual or visual image, Gregory writing at his desk, Manassis walking around the mosaic and seeing it, the book that results from this bodily act is itself a body held in the hands of its readers. We discover here an essential trait of Byzantine culture. The spirituality of vision is juxtaposed, combined, or even played against the corporeality of discourse. This is a phenomenon peculiar to societies where orality, textuality, and visuality form an entity of material and immaterial presence. On the opening pages of a 14th century manuscript containing the medical works attributed to Hippocrates, we find two portraits. On the left, Hippocrates, an author of the book, is symmetrically juxtaposed on the right to the great admiral Alexius Apokafkos and commissioner of the manuscript. Both persons are displayed in a frontal position and are dressed in their historical functions as Hellenic sage and Byzantine state official, respectively. On the margins, as you can see, around each portrait, two long poems have been copied out. Hypocrites is framed by a poem in praise of Alexios, Alexios by a poem in praise of Hippocrates. The ancient doctor, holding a lancet as if it were a pen, points to his open book where his most famous saying is inscribed. Life is short, art long, and time swift. The same book with the same saying lies open on the lectern to the right of the owner. This doubly depicted book, bridging historical time and manuscript space, is also the very object that the readers hold in their hands. Thus, the immaterial bodies of the author and the owner have become the material body of the book. This notion of the body as a text to be read finds its reflection in the notion of the text as a body to be handled. For example, in the Typikon, the monastic order of the Kosmosotira monastery, founded by the learned Prince Isaac Komnenos in the middle of the 12th century, the founder stipulates the following. Besides the books I have bequeathed to the monastery, and whose number is indicated in the monastery's inventory, I have bequeathed another book in which, through labor of many years, I have collected my own poems in different meters, various letters, and descriptions. I do not wish this book to lie in an obscure place, but to be shown for reading and for my commemoration to diligent persons wishing to study books and all kinds of stories. The founder's literary works have become a body to be displayed and handled by members of his monastic community in an act of reading as a form of pious commemoration. The text as written body becomes a relic with powers of its own, just as the body of a saint becomes the narrative text of his or her martyrdom. In a splendid 13th century icon from Sinai, Saint Catherine is framed by the visual text of her martyrdom. In one of the narrative scenes, placed to the left of her head, Catherine is flogged by an executioner in front of the Roman emperor. Her blood-stained body is simultaneously viewed and read because the image includes an inscription describing the scene, Catherine being flogged. The narrative visualization of martyrdom finds its equivalent in the narrative textualization of its story. For example, in the 7th century Passion of Saint Marina of Antioch, the martyr at the hour of her death asks of Christ, if someone takes pains to write my martyrdom, and if someone obtains it, let his name appear in the book of life. And if my book is in someone's hands and he puts it on his knees, he shall be absolved from his transgressions, and being thus freed, he shall honor the place where he lived. Christ, who is present during this prayer, assures the young woman that, his words, where your body is laid, I shall send to that place my mercy. And where the written record of your struggle is to be found, I shall send my angels to give people there the courage to defeat the devil. Therefore, know, Marina, that I have placed a seal on your written record through which a remission of sins shall be effected. Marina's female voice concentrates on her martyrdom and her book as objects to be narrated and to be handled, while Christ's male voice focuses on the written record as a legal document of authority. Through this contrasting pair of discourses, the text of the narrative becomes a body equated to or even interchangeable with the body of the martyr, both of them relics of the same power placed within layers of spiritual signification and corporeal performance. Martyrdom narrated as a visualized and textualized body finds a most powerful expression in the passion of the 40 martyrs of Sebastia, a group of Roman soldiers who, because of their espousal of Christianity, were condemned by their commander to die naked on a frozen lake in winter time. In a late 10th century ivory triptych panel, the owner holds the closed object in his hands as if it were a book. Upon opening it, the owner is confronted with a complex composition. Military saints stand in 2 rows to the left and to the right of the central panel. There, below Christ's majestic appearance as King of Glory, the bodies of the 40 martyrs are pressed the one next to the other and stand freezing in pain and prayer. The 40 bodies, placed in intermingled layers, become a visual text of corporeal martyrdom. This image of layered bodies takes a dramatically symmetrical form in an early 12th century fresco from the Church of the Virgin Mary at Asinu in Cyprus. In clearly delineated 4 rows of 10, the bodies of the 40 martyrs stand as if rising towards Christ, who looks down from the barrel vault. At the top of the fresco, we can see 3 rows of 40 objects floating in mid-air. They are the crowns of martyrdom and the visible proof that Christ has accepted the struggle of the 40 soldiers. Between the standing bodies and the floating crowns, an inscription is to be found, arranged in 2 rows and written out in large capital letters. The inscription is a poem in 4 verses and reads as following. Winter it is that causes pain, flesh it is that suffers here. If you pay attention, you may even hear the groans of the martyrs. But should you not hear anything, they will still endure the violent cold, looking to their crowns and not to their toils. The inscription fits perfectly. In addressing the viewer, the poem not only points to the painting, flesh it is that suffers here, but also includes an acoustic reference to the groans emitted by the tortured bodies, as well as a visual reference to the crowns above their heads. However, the poem was not composed by the commissioner or the artist at the time the fresco was painted in Cyprus. It is a poem written about 140 years earlier by the famous Constantinopolitan poet John Geometris around the year 980, 990, and probably for a portable icon. Through the use of intertextual and intervisual layers, the Asino artist has reinforced the sense of self-absorption and self-representation in his version of the martyrdom. The inscription's admonition to the viewer to pay attention marks an important aspect in the relation of Byzantine men and women to works of art. The multiple layers within the fresco can be activated only by the intense attention of the mind channeled through the eye gazing at the painting. By looking attentively, the viewer recalls visual and textual memories of earlier similar experiences that reaffirm the truth of the painting's spiritual precept. Plotinus, the Neoplatonic philosopher in the 3rd century, had defined such experiences in the following manner. He, that is, the man who experiences mental and visual intuition, gazes beyond what is beautiful in conventional or absolute terms, having already stepped beyond the circular dance of the virtues. He thus resembles a person who, having entered the sanctuary of a temple and having returned, leaves behind him the statues of the temple and a momentary coexistence with the divine itself. Leaving then the sanctuary, he sees the statues again. This is a second vision. Yet this process may not simply be a visual impression, but a wholly different way of looking, a standing outside, a simplification of the mind, an abandonment of the self, a wish for communion, and a comprehension of adjustment. The mental and emotional imagery employed by Plotinus is built around the notion that the eye is an inward gate leading to the self, and that the eye's gaze is an outward dart leading to the other. The phrase standing outside is in the original Greek no other word than ecstasis. In all of Byzantine art, men and women depicted as representations of their ideal selves throw their darting gazes to the viewers in order to open the gates of their eyes, so that in their turn, the viewers will direct their gaze towards the absorbing images in a wish for communion and a comprehension of adjustment. Let me return to Gregory of Nazianzus. Gregory, who was a major exponent in the Christian appropriation of Neoplatonic philosophy, transferred this internalized ocular movement between the soul and the divine to the relation between writing and painting. He explicitly presented Basil of Caesarea as the model subject of, in the opening of the funeral oration he composed for his friend Basil of Caesarea, he explicitly presented Basil as the model subject of a laudatory discourse similar to the model images used by artists in the composition of their paintings. At the end of the oration, Gregory returns to the image he used in the prologue. Addressing his audience, he says, "I have mixed lamentation with praise depicted the conduct of this man through my discourse, and set up for eternity a painting of virtue common to all and a salvific model for all souls, so that when looking up to him as if to an animate law, we might direct our lives. I would moreover counsel you who are initiated in his teachings always to look at him and to let yourselves be formed by the Holy Spirit as if he were seeing you and you were seeing him. Gregory's oration has become the exemplary representation of an exemplary bishop. Through this discursive painting, listeners are transformed into viewers whose ecstatic gaze is palpably united with the spiritual eye of the deceased, yet ever-present Basil. Layer upon layer, Gregory has created a work wherein words as colors and colors as words form an entity of profound emotional and spiritual power, implicitly suggesting that this power is the effect of art on humans. In the 6th century, the poet Agapitos wrote an epigram to accompany an icon of the archangel Michael, an image probably, and here we can be a little bit imaginary, not unsimilar to this 13th century icon of the archangel Gabriel from Sinai. The poem runs as follows. Colored wax has depicted the invisible and incorporeal leader of the angelic hosts. How great a daring! And yet, this is not improper, because he who looks at the painting directs his soul towards a higher vision. No more does his piety waver. The angel's eyes steer up the mind in its depth. Art has the knowledge to transport with its colors the images of the heart. In yet another Plotinian reflection, the painting activates the memories of experience in the minds of the viewer, while the accompanying poem describes this mental and emotional process leading to a state of ecstasy. Through the gaze of the eye, painting and poetry transport the viewer's mind and heart from the depth of the human self towards the higher vision of the divine other. Inextricably linked in Byzantine art and literature, the notions of height and depth unite the spiritual and corporeal cosmos of intervisual and intertextual memory into a nexus of mental and sensual experiences that are kept in constant activity through intellectual and sensory perception. In a mosaic barrel vault ceiling from a 5th century sanctuary, the so-called Mausoleum of Empress Galla Placidia in Ravenna, the layered stars placed on the bright blue firmament form such a visually active cosmos. Each star is an entity similar to and yet distinct from the other, that absorbs luminous energy into its center, thus representing in visual terms the incomprehensible power of divine presence in distance. Hundreds of years later, Emperor Theodore II Lascaris, a talented writer and intellectual, composed in 1255 to 1257 a series of 10 orations on Christian theology. The 4th oration is entitled On Naming God. The work consists of a brief preface followed by a list of 700 appellations of God. In the preface, Theodore writes, I shall, according to my capacity, name God from the actions of his divine signs, not demonstrating from the names his nature, nor proclaiming from namelessness his power. But in telling the names, I leave him outside the names, and I condense him as the cohesive foundation of the universe inside the depth of words, pronouncing that the Lord is everything in everything, as the Apostle Paul has pronounced. Just like the stars on the Mosaic sky, the words on the parchment page of this 12th century Luke gospel are distinct yet related entities that absorb semantic energy into their center. Theodore Lascaris continues, therefore, a lover of memory and educated in philosophy will find hundreds and thousands of appellations should he carefully research divine actions in this world. But I, either through research, will find, or opening my mouth with the help of his power according to Paul, will piously utter what is reasonable. However, says the emperor, the reader should not rest the power of his mind only at the surface of the words, but he should examine their depth and attempt to interpret them according to his capacity. For the meaning of names encompasses a certain divine state. Names do not simply and accidentally lie before us. They connote activities that are indicative of divine magnificence. When recited aloud, the list of God's 700 names with its emotive, vocal, and rhythmical grouping of words transports the reader's mind into a state of ecstasis. This effect is the result of human research and divine inspiration. Words are worlds replete with active meanings to be interpreted by lovers of memory educated in philosophy. Within Byzantine culture, no clearer perception of intertextuality as memory active and contemplation productive can be found. The notion that writing is the result of human research and divine inspiration goes back to the opening paragraph of the Gospel according to Luke. Says the evangelist, for as much as many which from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have taken in hand to draw up a narrative of those things which are most surely believed among us, even as they delivered them unto us. It seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write unto thee in order, most excellent Theophilus, that thou mightest know the certainty of those words wherein thou hast been instructed. Luke is the only evangelist who explicitly introduces himself as an I-speaking authorial persona. The author, having had memory of all events from the very beginning, sets out to compose an orderly narrative that transforms the spoken word of Christ and of his disciples into the written word of his own text. This transposition of a witnessed verbal truth from an oral to a written medium is an essential authorizing device of the new religion. The older layer of oral storytelling is absorbed through the acts of remembering and writing into the new layer of textual narrative. In Byzantine book illumination, like in this example from an early 11th century manuscript, Luke is usually portrayed as an author engaged in the act of writing. Byzantine theologians and artists obviously recognized the transferal from orality to textuality encoded in Luke's preface, and in some cases expressed this transferal. For example, in this miniature, the lectern behind Luke's desk is empty, signifying the void space of orality, now substituted by the leaf of parchment being filled with words, as the evangelist writes. In a 13th century gospel, Luke is represented in another very important function for a manuscript culture. The evangelist is no longer an author, but a scribe, copying from another manuscript to which he looks with intense concentration. However, there is something surprising in this particular miniature. The manuscript on the lectern is written in monumental majuscule letters, while the scribe copies out his text in a rounded minuscule script. The illuminator, or his model, has interpreted the Gospel's preface in a manner consonant with his own historical perception of copying, and has introduced another layer of textual authority. For a number of reasons, Byzantine scribes started abandoning in the late 8th century the use of the authoritative but ancient uncial script, as it is beautifully copied out on a page from the oldest surviving manuscript of the Old Testament, written in the 4th century. This ancient script was substituted by a calligraphic minuscule that henceforth became the standard way of writing, as it was finely executed, for example, on a page from, you see here, the oldest Plato manuscript written in the late 9th century. The image then of the evangelist as a scribe who faithfully copies his exemplar is the final layer of authorization in a culture that emphasizes mimesis as a simultaneously creative and recreative artistic act. To the representations of Luke as an author at the moment of writing or as a scribe at the moment of copying, Byzantine artists added a third one that completes the role of the evangelist as the active recreator of a divine image. In a splendid miniature from an 11th century manuscript, the evangelist appears now as a professional painter who copies the Virgin and her son as his models. The iconographic similarity of this scene to the one where Luke copies from a manuscript is quite striking. With the same intense gaze, the painter, holding the wooden panel as if it were a leaf of parchment, writes out with colors the corporeal image of divine truth sitting in front of him, as if it were the manuscript placed on a lectern. Even the tools of the respective artists are depicted in the same place, spatially separating the body of the artist from the body of his model. The structural identity of the two scenes imposes on the Byzantine viewers the notional identity between the acts of writing and painting. Thus, the layers of visual and textual memory become, on the one hand, the guarantors of divine truth, while on the other, they signify the Christian concept of artistic inspiration. In fact, these layers of memory enter through the mouth into the artist's spiritual and corporeal body as edible material in order to exit again through the mouth from the artist's body as textual or visual material. This very particular form of absorption and ensuing emission is described most vividly by the author of the book of Revelation. I quote, "And the voice which I heard from heaven spake unto me again and said, Go and take the little book which is open in the hand of the angel. And I went unto the angel and said unto him, Give me the little book. And he said unto me, Take it and eat it up. And it shall make thy belly bitter, but it shall be in thy mouth sweet as honey. And I took the little book out of the angel's hand and ate it up. And it was in my mouth sweet as honey. And as soon as I had eaten it, my belly was bitter." The angelic book tastes sweet in the prophet's mouth because it must entice him to continue absorbing the divine truth, but it feels bitter in his belly because it must stir him to emit the words of prophetic wisdom. Let us look at a Byzantine case of imbibed inspiration. A luxurious manuscript from the late 10th century preserves a vast collection of brief notices of saints' lives. It is the famous Menologion of Emperor Basil II. Every page of the book is arranged in such a manner that the lower half is taken up with the brief notice, while the upper half is dominated by a miniature depicting the central episode of the narrative. Listed under the date of October 1st, we find the story of Saint Romanos the Melodist, the creator of the Kontakion. And this is the passage that I will read to you in translation. The notice writes, "One night, as Romanos was sleeping in the Church of the Virgin at Kyros Quarter, the Holy Mother of God appeared to him in his dream and gave him a scroll, saying, 'Take the scroll and eat it up.' The saint thought that he was indeed opening his mouth and imbibing the scroll. It was the morning of the feast of Holy Christmas. He immediately arose from his sleep and stood in astonishment, praising God. Then he ascended the pulpit's steps and began chanting, 'Today the Virgin gives birth to him who is above all being.' The famous opening of the first Christmas Kontakion, I Parthenos Simeron ton Hyperousion Picti. The miniaturist has chosen to depict this key act. The Mother of God is about to thrust the scroll into the saint's mouth as he sleeps on a mattress in front of the church. The exceptional poetic talent of Romanos is textually and visually explained through the image of divinely provided food taken into his body. This imbibing results in Romanos spontaneously reciting his most famous work. The layers of memory swallowed down and thrown up in this bodily act find their semantic inversion in another bodily act of cosmic significance. As a result of Adam's decision to eat from the tree of paradise, Hades had been devouring the living since the creation of the world. With Christ's death and resurrection, this original sin was annulled, and Hades was forced to yield the dead. It is Romanos who, in his Kontakion on the triumph of the cross, represented Christ's life-giving death as the punishment of gluttonous Hades. The hymn's first strophe reads as follows. 3 crosses did Pilate drive into Golgotha, 2 for the thieves and 1 for the life-giver. When Hades saw him, he said to those below, "Oh, my ministers and my attendants, who drove this nail into my heart? A wooden spear has suddenly pierced me, and I am torn apart. My entrails are aching, and my belly is in pain. Oh, my senses! My breath steers in agitation, and I am forced to vomit Adam and Adam's children given to me by a wood. A wood now leads them back into paradise." Through a narratorial shift, Christ's martyrdom is seen and felt by Hades, who becomes the main narrating voice of the poem. A voice, moreover, colored, as you heard, by a humorous undertone. In an inverted image of the crucifixion, the cross now pierces the ruler of the dead. Hades himself links this new wood of the cross, onto which the Savior's body was nailed, to the old wood of the tree of paradise, while he also links the spear that pierced Christ's side with the implement of torture impaling his own abdomen. In contrast to the creative act of penetration imposed on the poet's body by the Virgin Mary, forcing Romanos to utter his inspired poem, this punitive act of penetration forces the underworld to throw up the dead he has been holding in his belly. The tortured bodies of Christ and Hades are thus poetically correlated in a set of chiastic antitheses. In this 10th century ivory icon, the textual image created by Romanos is recast by the anonymous artist as a visual image. The dead body of Christ at the upper end of the cross is the victorious space of life, while the living body of Hades at the lower end is the defeated space of death. The composition, which includes the mourning figures of Mary and John, as well as the soldiers dividing the clothes of Christ, is framed by a huge canopy that emphasizes the sense of self-absorption and self-representation. Moreover, the correlation of the icon to Romanos's poem is clearly marked for the Byzantine recipients by an inscription placed to the right of Hades's body. It reads, "The cross driven into the belly of Hades," a direct reference to the key words of the hymn's first strophe. The acts of eating and vomiting are then an intertextual and intervisual imprint, typos is the Greek word, that readers and viewers are invited to interpret according to the layers of memory embedded in themselves. The concept of imprint is, of course, of paramount importance for an understanding of the aesthetic principles governing Byzantine art and literature. 4 portable icons of Christ, the Almighty Word, dating from the 6th, early 12th, late 12th, and 14th century, respectively, might serve to illustrate this concept. In each of the 4 icons, even without an explicative text inscribed, Byzantine viewers immediately recognized the Son of God in his human form. The 4 icons are, in the words of John of Damascus, imprints of the unimprintable and figures of the unfigurable. By depicting the person of Christ in a manner totally contrary to our perceptions and notions of originality, the 4 artists succeeded in transferring the unimprintable archetype to 4 imprintable types that are simultaneously the same as the archetype and yet distinct from each other. In other words, the atemporal singularity of divine nature and the temporal plurality of human nature merge through intervisual layering. Basil of Caesarea in the 4th century most clearly expressed this notion of visual transferal from archetype to type, relating it moreover to the study of Christian literature and viewing such study as a similar process of textual transferal. In a letter addressed to his friend Gregory of Nazareth, he writes, "As you know, painters, when painting an image from an image, will frequently direct their gaze to the model, applying their efforts in transferring the character traits from there to their own artistic creation. In just as many cases, the person applying his efforts in perfecting himself through virtue will direct his gaze to the lives of holy men, as if to some animate and moving statues, so that he might make the goodness of these men his own through imitation." That Basil was able to relate word and image in their functions as icons of verbal and visual archetypes is partly due to the Greek language itself. The verb grapho means to write and to paint, while the noun graphi signals writing as well as painting. It is on account of this lexical identity that for speakers of Greek, a writer paints a writing and a painter writes a painting. To conclude, Byzantine art and literature are dynamically three-dimensional in exploring visual height and textual depth, consciously philosophical in activating spiritual and emotional memory, and unexpectedly postmodern in creating structures of multiple significations. In other words, self-absorption and self-representation, transparency and obscurity, intertextuality and intervisuality, textual and corporeal performances constitute crucial concepts inherent in Byzantine culture through which writers and painters expressed their very own aesthetics of layering. Thank you very much.
I think this is where I come in. All right. You can hear me, yes? Excellent. All right. So I should like first to take the opportunity to thank the organizers of this genuinely stimulating series. The possibility of such long distance discussions, I think, is one of the few salutary collateral effects of the pandemic. And you know, perhaps we will think more about how to take advantage of them in the future. Now, I would like to express a different kind of thanks, this time to Panayotis Sergapitos. And allow me to explain briefly the point of this gratitude. A great many of us who work in and with Byzantine literature have had repeated recourse to Panagiotis' scholarship over the years. And I think it's a fair compliment to observe that he is a fixture in many of our footnotes. Now, I mentioned this in connection with today's presentation, because it is quite uncommon, I think, for someone whose stature is as secure within a discipline as Panayotis's is, to proceed, as he has, I think, today, to confound perhaps his loyal readers with work which is sure to unsettle some of their tacit assumptions about the nature of their subject and the best way to approach it. Now, since this methodologically discomfiting originality of the ideas presented today, I think will emerge best through discussion rather than through recapitulation or summary on my part, I'm going to restrict myself to a single observation followed by some questions for Panayotis. And I apologize in advance because these questions invariably reflect my own interests and cannot hope to represent the no doubt various questions which the audience might pose. Now, my first brief observation, and I hope the significance of this will become more apparent in the course of our discussion, is as follows. I would venture, especially to an audience who was gathered for a series convened by art historians, that we are accustomed, or at least more accustomed, to Byzantine art historians having recourse to texts for a variety of interpretive purposes, some no doubt more debatable or persuasive than others. Still, I think it's a common enough practice to merit little attention per se. We are, however, far less accustomed as philologists or historians of Byzantine literature to seeing the image marshaled not just as a complement to the text, but as a dimension of the text, almost a constituent element of a shared meaning. And I dare say that very few philologists I know would venture into the vast terrain of the Byzantine image, where it may be said with perhaps more than proverbial truth, angels fear to tread. The reason I dwell on this in connection with what I said earlier about Panayotis's perhaps confounding colleagues who have looked to his insights about various aspects of Byzantine literature is that many of us will have seen him as an advocate for literature as a self-sustaining aesthetic and intellectual enterprise. Indeed, those of us brought up on post-structuralist poetics have had little reason to worry that our understanding of texts, any texts for that matter, lacked some important or indispensable referent in the visual arts. And I hasten here to say that such a view has never been explicitly endorsed in any of Panayotis's work, but many will have presumed it because it was not called into question openly. Though as readers of his novels, I think, set in Byzantium might have discerned, Panayotis has long nurtured a far more integrated understanding of what, for lack of a better word, we might call Byzantine sensibility and the commensurate Geisteswissenschaft. I really cannot think of a corresponding English term, and I'm sorry, required to bring this sensibility to light in scholarship. Now, so much for the observation. Now for the questions. And I'm going to list them briefly so as to introduce them, but I can repeat them as needed because I don't expect Panayotis to memorize them. And
I have a notebook and I'm ready,
okay.
ready to write.
Panayotis, you moved confidently across a span of nearly 1,000 years from the 4th to the 14th century and back, identifying corresponding elements in texts and images that in what will seem to some like an almost static frame at times. And I am sure you anticipated that such an analysis might incur the old charge of seeing the Byzantine arts as suffering from a kind of cultural and intellectual inertia. How might we reap the benefit of such a survey without suggesting that nothing of significance changed in the Byzantine understanding of these things? So that's number one. My second question or comment is that you begin with concepts familiar to students of rhetoric and literature: ipsos, vastos, enargia, saphia, height, depth, well, enargia, and opacity, lack of clarity. But in the course of harnessing them to what you described as a layered reading of both text and image, you have effectively defamiliarized these concepts. I felt this most acutely with enargia and asaphia listening to you, which I thought I understood, but now will hesitate to invoke either of those quite so readily. I especially found it interesting that you contrasted these two. Are you suggesting that our understanding of such core rhetorical concepts has been incomplete because we have limited ourselves to texts. And the third and final, at least for the moment, question is, you have selected texts that are intellectually or interpretively consonant with this remarkably rich collection of images we just saw. I am wondering what other kinds of Byzantine literature, prose or verse, look like from the vantage that you have set out here today. So I'll stop there and we can get to some of those. And of course, I can repeat any of them if you want me to.
Thank you, Manoli. First of all, I mean, for your kind words, but I don't think I deserve them that much, in the sense that you must not forget that I actually studied art history in Munich when I was an undergraduate. It was part of my program. And for me, the combination of these fields was extremely and is very strong. It is just that by becoming, so to speak, a professional philologist, although I don't identify myself exactly like that, I didn't concentrate on that. And so this talk and this part of a little book that I am writing gives me the opportunity to combine some of my interests in literature, which is the problem of narrative, the problem of genres, that has very much to do with the history of Byzantine literature, of course, with the works of art and the cultural, visual production, because I think that they cannot be seen as separate entities. They have to be seen within a broader cultural frame. And this brings me immediately to your first and very important question about the static frame. It is absolutely, you're absolutely right, that we had that Byzantine culture was seen as this totally static culture where everything seemed unchangeable. And this is partly due to the Byzantines themselves, who have been playing these tricks with us, both in their visual production, but also in their texts. I mean, when one reads, for example, prefaces to law books, it seems as everything is exactly the same since the time of Justinian. And then you look at the actual law book and there's totally different things happening there. So, but what I was interested in initially is to see if there are certain cultural parameters that are common to the way in which visual artists and textual artists operate. And this is what I'm trying to show. I'm not trying to suggest that this is an unmovable, static thing, but that it is negotiable, and it can be negotiable in many different ways. And your third question, you see, is intelligently connected to the first, because I chose some of my examples. I chose them exactly to show what I was thinking about. You can make a totally different set of selection and produce very different results. Okay. The interesting thing, however, is that when we get into the easy taxonomic mode, because it's something that we have been brought up with, and I'm talking now specifically about literature, that we have this distinction: high literature, lower literature, secular literature, ecclesiastic literature, and we make these divisions, we very easily fall into ahistorical categories, because we perceive then the texts as something existing in a vacuum. Okay, like, oh, all of high level literature is one thing, all of low level literature is another thing, and they're not particularly related to each other. But when you actually look at the texts, you see, and that's why, for me, the example with the hymn of Romanos and the 10th century ivory panel is very interesting, or the way in which Luke is depicted as a scribe and a painter, is you see that these people used patterns, ways of describing that made clear some of the parameters of their cultural beliefs. These cultural beliefs, they could change. They were put into doubt, especially in periods of crisis, so that new things and other sets of beliefs were developed and reinforced. And yet, at the same time, as part of a response to these crises, people would pick up the old material and look back to it and use it again in a kind of way that made older scholars believe that the meaning of this older material was unchanged from the early times to the later times. For example, I will give you a very small literary example. In the late 9th century, Emperor Leo VI, known as Leo the Wise, wrote a funeral oration to his father and mother that he delivered at the second year of commemoration of his father's death in the summer of 888. This funeral oration was unanimously condemned for being utterly boring and a total imitation of the old handbook of Pseudo-Menander's instructions about how to write an imperial oration. When one takes a step back and looks and asks a very simple and totally naive question, are there other funeral orations written at the time of Leo? Can I look at something else to compare it? Which for some peculiar reason no one had done. One finds that in about a 30 years time around Leo, 4 other funeral orations were composed. These funeral orations, not a single one resembles Leo's piece. It has nothing to do with the Menandrian model. On the contrary, they are all looking extremely different, the one from each other. They belong to different modes of way of writing and are very, very different. So in my opinion, within this experimental phase, Leo decides to experiment by picking up the old thing, bringing it to the fore, and making something new. So for his readers or listeners, what he presented was extraordinary because no one had heard something like that before. So we can turn this idea of imitation as boredom into a totally different creative approach to looking at things. This is what I call the layers of memory. And this brings me to your second question about the different way of looking at the concepts, the rhetorical concepts. You see, the thing is this: we are totally set through our training that antiquity is a basis on which Byzantium, was founded, and that these people used the material that they had at hand, that they preserved, that they studied, in a way consonant to contemporary classical philology. I mean, that they actually, and if they did not, if it looks as they do not do that, somehow they fail. When in recent times we start looking at these things, and you have done that in your own book on manuals on Eustathius's funeral oration, when you start looking more carefully at what the author, and a highly educated author at that, is doing, it proves that with great consciousness they are using this material in their own very different way. And then things begin to make sense. The words begin to have a meaning in a historical environment. Right? They begin to respond to the needs of a specific society and not to appear as exercises in vanity. And I think, if I may say so, this is what I have been trying to do, to show that a number of things have very much a meaning, but it is not necessarily the meaning that we believe that they do have. And if we step out of our own educational prejudices, and there has been a lot done in this respect, it's not as if we are, not doing things, then you get some highly interesting results. And that's why I would very much like to have more discussion between the various fields of Byzantine studies on matters of methodology of interpretation, because this is going to bring us together better into an understanding of what this whole Byzantine culture was and how it changed and evolved, while at the same time giving the impression that it did not. Yeah, I think.
As I tried to suggest in one of the questions, that as philologists or historians of literature, when we are asked to account for something in the text, we routinely point to what our author will have, or we suspect will have read.
Exactly.
And it's far less common for us to point to what the author may have seen. And
Absolutely.
this, and this is why I say there is an element of defamiliarization in invoking rhetorical concepts, rhetorical in the sense that we are used to thinking of them. If it's not written down somewhere, but the idea that the rhetorical concept, that rhetoric, which is not in itself such a radical suggestion, that rhetoric is not merely a matter of words in the ordinary sense. Still, it's quite. You are implicitly throwing down the gauntlet here to a large part of your field and saying, look, there is something unfinished about the work we are doing with the texts if we are constantly explaining texts only with reference to other texts.
I agree.
Yes. Which has been something of a banner under which philology, and certainly the highly theorized approach to texts, has taken for some decades now. I mean, and so this kind of pointing in this like this, or setting up this kind of example, I think has some pretty serious implications for what we are doing, or what we think we are doing.
Yes, no, I mean, you are right. I mean, I didn't see it exactly as throwing a gauntlet, but certainly I pick up your word that I see this as an unfinished work, that there is a lot that we need to do to go beyond, I mean, us as literary critics and philologists, to go beyond this safe space of the abstract word and move into the realm of materiality. And that is why I very firmly believe, and you have done that yourself, that looking not only at the printed texts, but looking at the manuscripts, you come to discover very much what was in the minds and in the hearts of the users of these books, from very humble products to extremely luxury products. But when you look even at these luxury products, you realize that they are prepared not only with in a romantic sense, high and deep understanding of nature and God, but also in a very practical, down-to-earth way about what they want to present to the user of the text. even in the case of a luxury manuscript that probably wasn't very much used. Still, it is made for someone. And for me, this is very important. The texts also, they're not made for the author. They are made for someone else who is there and who as a recipient plays a very important part in this. Yeah, I think a little bit defamiliarization is not a bad idea. Yeah.
I see that we are coming up to the time, and our hosts
has appeared.
I think it's last call, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm truly sorry to put an end to this absolutely fascinating discussion, but I'm grateful to Professor Agapitos for his paper, and to Professor Bourbouhakis for this very stimulating discussion. I think both our audience and our students and colleagues found many useful things, and it's certainly a lot of food for thought for both historians of art and text people. Our last lecture of this series by Professor Anne-Marie Weil-Carr, titled The Ziareti of Kikos, the Kikotissa meets the Ottomans, will take place at noon again on Friday, April the 8th. And we hope that you'll be able to join us. Until then, be safe and be well. Bye-bye.